In geopolitics, power doesn't always announce itself with gunfire. Sometimes it arrives as a map update, a new shipping lane, a quiet military upgrade, a consulate reopening in a city most people can't locate on a globe. And right now, the world's map is changing at the top. For centuries, the Arctic Ocean was not an ocean in the strategic sense. It was a barrier, frozen, inaccessible, and hostile to navigation. It protected borders simply by existing. But that protection is thinning. Satellite records and modern climate research show the Arctic has been warming far faster than the global average, close to 4 times in recent decades. That warming does something that rewires global power. It turns ice into water. And water, to empires, is opportunity. A new ocean is being born, not because the Earth grew a new sea, but because an old one is becoming usable. And once it becomes usable, the question becomes brutally simple: who controls it? This is why Greenland is suddenly everywhere. Greenland is the largest island in the world, but it has a population smaller than many small cities, about 56,000 people. It is vast, isolated, and difficult. Outside the capital, Nuuk, towns are not connected by roads. People move by air and sea. It is a place where geography still wins arguments, and it is also the gateway to the high north. The story begins with a mistake many people make. They treat Greenland like a remote side quest in global politics, but historically, Greenland has been a strategic hinge. During World War II, when Denmark fell under Nazi occupation, the United States stepped into Greenland's security picture. By the Cold War, Greenland became part of an Arctic shield. Early warning systems, radar chains, and forward positions built for a nightmare scenario. Soviet bombers and missiles coming over the pole. Today, you can still find the physical remains of that era. Abandoned American infrastructure in the Arctic. Huge radar dishes and decaying installations that look like science fiction props left behind after the world moved on. And for a while, it did move on. After the Soviet collapse, the Arctic felt quieter. The American posture shrank. Greenland became, again, what most outsiders assumed it was: frozen distance. But that quiet wasn't peace, it was pause. Because beneath the ice was time. Time until the ice melted enough to matter. Now that time is ending. The most immediate prize is trade. 2 routes define the new Arctic chessboard. On the Russian side lies the Northern Sea Route, hugging Russia's northern coastline, connecting the Atlantic side of Eurasia to the Pacific. In 2024, Russia's state operator reported a record cargo volume of about 37.9 million tons shipped along the route. Russia is building infrastructure, ports, and ice-class shipping capacity around the idea that this route will grow as ice retreats. For China, this matters because China's economy is a machine that runs on maritime supply chains. Its largest strategic anxiety is not just an enemy fleet, it's choke points. Straits that can be pressured. Routes that can be blocked. So the Arctic becomes attractive as a diversification strategy. Not a replacement, but a leverage tool, a second door. On the Canadian side lies the Northwest Passage cutting through the Canadian Arctic archipelago. If conditions allow, it can shorten some routes compared to transiting the Panama Canal. One reason it keeps reappearing in strategic discussions. But the Northwest Passage carries a legal problem that is also a power problem. Canada has long argued that much of the passage is internal waters, meaning it can regulate access like a sovereign corridor. The United States has typically rejected that framing and emphasized freedom of navigation, because if Washington accepts one major precedent of states turning strategic routes into domestic waters, the precedent doesn't stay in the Arctic. It spreads. It becomes a tool other coastal powers could copy elsewhere. So as the ice melts, it doesn't just open routes. It opens arguments, legal, diplomatic, military. And this is where Greenland becomes more than geography, it becomes positioning. Because Greenland sits beside the Atlantic-Arctic seam, it's near the spaces where submarines, surface fleets, and aircraft may contest access between the high north and the North Atlantic. During the Cold War, one of the most strategically discussed choke areas in the North Atlantic was the GIUK Gap, an arc formed by Greenland, Iceland, and the UK that has long been relevant for tracking naval movement between the North Atlantic and the Northern Seas. That logic hasn't disappeared. It has returned, modernized, digitized, and extended into space. Greenland's most critical American foothold is the U.S. base in the far north, Pitufik Space Base, formerly Thule Air Base. It is central to missile warning and space surveillance, tied into the US and NATO early warning architecture. If you want to understand why Greenland is a security obsession in Washington, start there. Because the Arctic isn't only about ships. It's about trajectories. Missiles flying over the pole. Submarines under the ice. Satellites watching everything above it. And now, US strategists look at the Arctic and see a widening gap between America's posture and its rivals. Russia, in particular, has treated the Arctic as a core theater for years, investing in bases, runways, logistics, and ice-capable infrastructure. And Russia possesses something no other country has at the same scale: the world's only nuclear icebreaker fleet. Icebreakers aren't glamorous military icons. But in the Arctic, logistics is power. If you can't move, refuel, escort, and sustain presence, you don't control anything. You just visit. China is the second pressure point. China calls itself a near-Arctic state in its Arctic policy framing, and it has pushed for influence through investment, research presence, and partnership with Russia. The point isn't that China owns the Arctic. The point is that China wants a seat at any table that redraws global trade and security. And then, suddenly, the United States begins acting like Greenland is no longer distant. In 2020, the US reopened a diplomatic post in Nuuk, re-establishing a consulate there for the first time since 1953. That's how geopolitics often moves. Not with conquest first, but with presence, buildings, staff, relationships, aid packages, agreements, the physical act of showing up. Now, layer one more fact onto this. Greenland is not fully independent. Greenland has extensive self-rule, but Denmark retains control over key pillars like foreign affairs and defense. That arrangement creates a triangle: Greenland, Denmark, and the United States, each with overlapping interests, each with lines they don't want crossed. And this triangle is now under stress because Donald Trump is back in office, and he has recentered Greenland in US political theater. In late January 2026, Trump publicly discussed a framework around Greenland access, saying negotiations were ongoing. He also said he had ruled out using force, while still describing the US aim as total access with no time limit, claims that immediately triggered pushback and red-line statements from Greenlandic and Danish leadership. So this is the situation. Trump's rhetoric is loud, but beneath it is a strategic reality that is not going away even when the headlines fade. The Arctic is opening. Russia is positioned. China is probing. America is recalibrating. And Greenland sits at the crossroads. But the story isn't only about bases and sea routes, it's also about minerals. Because the modern world runs on materials most people never think about: rare earths, graphite, specialized metals, inputs that sit inside your phone, your electric vehicle, your satellites, your missiles, your drones, your radars. Greenland has largely untapped mineral potential, including materials classified as critical by European frameworks. And this matters because supply chains are becoming weaponized. Countries are realizing that if you control processing and exports, you don't need to fire a shot to gain leverage. That's why Greenland is becoming valuable in two ways at once: as territory and as a resource bank. And that dual value is what makes it dangerous. Because when a place becomes valuable, the world starts calling it strategic. And once the world calls you strategic, you stop being left alone. Now, let's bring this down from grand strategy to the ground level. Because Greenland is not an empty board. It's a society with memory, with politics, with trauma, with ambitions. And that is where the Arctic power competition becomes unstable. Greenland's economy is heavily dependent on fishing exports and Danish financial support, with growing interest in diversification through tourism and mining. That economic structure creates vulnerability. Big infrastructure projects are expensive, and outside capital often arrives with conditions, even when those conditions are wrapped in polite language. This is how modern competition works. Not with invasions first, but with financing, construction contracts, licensing, and influence. In the late 2010s, Greenland explored major infrastructure upgrades, including airports, because if you want development, you need air connectivity. And when a small economy needs huge infrastructure, offers appear, loans appear, contractors appear. And this is where the China question enters the Greenland story so sharply. The United States has repeatedly signaled that it does not want China building strategic infrastructure in Greenland, especially infrastructure that could, in worst-case thinking, gain dual-use relevance. Even when such scenarios are debated and sometimes exaggerated, the logic driving Washington is consistent. If Greenland becomes a gateway to the Arctic, then control of gateways matters. So the U.S. approach has two tracks: block China's footholds and deepen U.S. ties. And Denmark, caught between alliance loyalty to Washington and sovereignty responsibility toward Greenland, has been forced to maneuver carefully. But Greenland itself is not passive. Greenland's political identity has been moving for years in a direction that outsiders often underestimate. Independence. Greenland's self-rule arrangement is not just administrative, it is tied to a long arc of decolonization logic. And that arc is fueled by historical grievances, cultural erasure, social policies imposed from afar, and a general sense that Greenland's story has been written by other capitals. So when an American president publicly speaks about Greenland as a strategic object, something to be acquired, controlled, or guaranteed, it does not just trigger diplomatic outrage in Copenhagen. It sends shockwaves through Greenlandic politics because it reframes independence debates under pressure, and pressure accelerates decisions. Now add another layer. Greenland's strategic assets already host U.S. military capability, and that reality is unlikely to diminish. Pituffik Space Base is not a symbolic outpost. It's integrated into missile warning and space surveillance networks, tied into NATO's wider security picture. That means Greenland will remain strategically relevant even if mining never reaches its theoretical peak, even if the Northwest Passage remains seasonal, even if some trade projections fall short. Because the Arctic is becoming a security theater, and security theaters create their own logic. If Russia increases its posture, NATO increases its posture. If China partners more openly with Russia, the US will push harder to deny space. If the US hardens Greenland access, Russia will frame that as containment. And so the spiral builds, often without any side explicitly choosing escalation, because each move becomes defensive inside its own narrative. This is why the Arctic is so risky. It's not one conflict, it's a stack of dilemmas. Trade routes plus sovereignty disputes, military basing plus freedom of navigation, resource competition plus indigenous rights, climate change plus strategic urgency. Now, return to Trump's role in this. Trump's rhetoric is often treated as improvisation. But even when the actor improvises, the plot can be real. In January 2026, Trump described negotiations around Greenland access and claimed a framework aimed at total access, while also stating he was not pursuing acquisition by force, comments that still provoked Greenland and Denmark to reassert sovereignty and boundaries publicly. So the real significance isn't whether a purchase happens. The real significance is that the US is signaling urgency. That Greenland and the High North are now treated as critical to American strategic planning. And there is a deeper strategic reason behind that urgency. The US is trying to prepare for simultaneous pressure points. Washington's long-term security planners increasingly think in terms of a world where the US must deter in Europe while also competing in the Pacific. That creates a demand for allies to carry more weight regionally, because the US cannot be everywhere at full strength forever. From that perspective, Greenland isn't a trophy, it's a forward position. And Denmark, in US eyes, is a weak holder of a crucial card. Not because Denmark is an enemy, but because Denmark's capacity is limited. This is why Denmark has responded with increased defense pledges and Arctic-focused investment announcements in recent years, trying to demonstrate seriousness and prevent Greenland from becoming a permanent transatlantic fracture point. And also, frankly, to keep the alliance from looking like it can be bullied. But here's the most important point. One most coverage misses. If the West mishandles Greenland, it hands rivals a narrative victory. Because Russia and China do not need to win a war to weaken NATO. They can weaken NATO by weakening trust, by amplifying fractures, by turning alliances into disputes over respect and sovereignty. And nothing fractures trust faster than the perception that allies treat each other like property. So the Greenland issue sits at the intersection of strategy and legitimacy. The US may have rational security motivations, but legitimacy is also power. And if legitimacy collapses, strategy becomes harder to execute. Meanwhile, Greenland stands in a unique position, small in population, huge in geography, increasingly central in leverage. That leverage is both a blessing and a trap. If Greenland opens too quickly to outside investment, it risks dependency and political capture. If it closes too tightly, it risks stagnation and continued reliance on Denmark. If it accelerates independence without economic foundations, it risks becoming a bargaining chip rather than a sovereign player. And in the background, the climate keeps moving. Indifferent to politics, the Arctic warms. The ice retreats. The routes become less hypothetical. And the world's great powers keep arriving. First with diplomats, then with contracts, then with bases, and eventually with doctrines. This is why Greenland matters. Not because it is a piece of land one leader talks about, but because it is a preview of the next era of geopolitics, where climate change doesn't just reshape weather, it reshapes borders, shipping, security, and power itself. The new ocean is being born, and every empire that wants to survive the next century is already looking north.